Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I thank Jackie Jeffs and Alliance for Life for inviting me here today. I want to begin with an apology, which is to simply point out that I suffer a degree of hearing loss, and that's going to inflict on you two things. First, it will mean that I'll probably talk a little louder than I should because I can't hear myself as well. And secondly, when we have questions and answers, you might have to be patient with me if I ask you to repeat yourself. As a member of Parliament, I always adopted the practice of starting any public presentation with an apology out of the firm belief that every Canadian citizen has the right, at least once in their life, to hear a politician apologize for something when it's warranted. So you could tell your grandchildren today was that day. Also, when I have any public presentation, I'm reminded of a story I once heard about something that happened in the early days of air flight when a couple of fellows were experimenting with ballooning and they didn't quite know what they were doing, and sure enough they lost control and drifted and didn't know where they were. They got lost and they spotted a fellow on the road down below, so they lowered the balloon a little bit and they hollered down to him, "Where are we?" And he thought about it for a minute and thoughtfully scratched his head, and finally he hollered back up to them, "You're up in a balloon." And as they floated away, the one fellow turned to the other and he said, "You know, that guy must have been a lawyer because everything he said was perfectly true, but also totally useless." And I remind myself of that story because I want, with all my heart, to not only speak truthfully to you, but also to leave you with some useful ideas and information going forward. I have several goals that I hope to accomplish in the next hour. The first is to define the issue of inhumane perjury and the foundational role of truth and justice in law. The second is to empower you with a conceptual understanding of that issue and hopefully illuminate its importance to contemporary society. Third, I wish to provide you with some historical and legal background relating to that issue. And last, I want to, I hope, leave you with an inspiration to act, with the idea that there are some things that you can do. And along the way, I hope to answer some questions for you, as well as to leave some time at the end of that thrilling hour of conceptual exploration. I'll begin by telling you a story about a little boy who was born and raised in the city of Kitchener, not too far from here. That's my story. My father was a veteran. He enlisted in 1941 in order to fight the Nazis. He ended up in Europe and part of that battle because he was opposed to the injustice and the inhumanity and the false claims of that wretched ideology. My mother was the daughter of immigrants from Eastern Europe, and she had a very close relationship with her grandmother, who was in fact a midwife and nurse in Eastern Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. And her grandmother impressed upon her the stories of suffering and hardship and injustice and difficulty that ordinary people in Eastern Europe at that time were afflicted with because of the power and domination games that were played with military aggression and inhumanity and false claims and injustice against them. When I was a boy, I would often see my mother reading the current events in the newspaper and listen to her frequently lamenting man's inhumanity against man. That was a common refrain with her, and I loved her for that, because I too lament that. She taught me to. And I admired my father. While I'm not a man of war, I admired my father's opposition to the perjury and the injustice and the inhumanity of the Nazis. Those were deep influences upon me. Also, of course, having been born in 1954, I actually was born only 9 years after the Nazis were defeated. And don't forget that up until 1945, their philosophy found favor with vast numbers of people. In fact, I was born less than 100 years after the abolition of slavery. If you can imagine, in today's world, slavery we know is an abhorrent practice, but it was less than 100 years before my birth that it was finally abolished in North America. I grew up under the shadow of the Soviet Union, and I was taught about the denial of rights, human rights, the suppression of belief and speech that occurred under that regime. I was taught about the Holodomor and the campaigns of starvation and murder and exile and banishment and suffering and injustice and inhumanity that occurred as I was growing up under that regime. It also was an influence upon my belief system. On the other hand, I grew up in the 1960s, and human rights and the protection of civil liberties at that time was in the very air we breathed. I often resort to pop culture, and I was impressed by the lyrics to The Age of Aquarius. I want to repeat them to you. Harmony and understanding, sympathy and trust abounding, no more falsehoods or derision, peace will guide the planets, and love will rule the stars. That's the milieu in which I grew up. Now, I've subsequently learned that I was fortunate, I was favored, because I grew up in Waterloo region, which I will never stop saying is one of the most prosperous areas in Ontario, which itself is one of the most prosperous provinces in Canada, which itself is the most favored nation on the face of the earth. And when I was growing up, we weren't subject to sectarian violence. There wasn't any overt racism. We treated each other as equals, and it was easy to do because there were no threats. We weren't facing any threats to our existence. I read once a quote from Liam Neeson, who grew up in Northern Ireland, saying that growing up as a Catholic in a predominantly Protestant town made him cautious. And he once said he felt like a second-class citizen there. I think it's harder for people who grow up in situations of conflict like that to embrace the idea that we are all equal and have equal worth, and that we should extend the hand of friendship, and that we should live in sympathy and harmony and peace and love with each other. I think it's harder when you grow up in a situation of conflict to embrace that, and you have to learn it a little differently. But for me, it was natural, and it was something that I was able to embrace without any difficulty, and it became part of my background, my being, my person. I should mention one other thing, and that is that at the ripe old age of 17, I was blessed to have had a profoundly religious experience. I was blessed to have touched divine love and to understand its impact and the value that it imparted to me and the value that divine love imparts to every other human being. And in response, my soul leapt with love in return. When you're loved, you can't help but reciprocate that. And so at an early age, I learned a sense of love, not only for the divine and for God, but also for the people I meet, those who I encounter in everyday life. That is real love, concern for the welfare of others. I mention all of this to explain to you the journey that brings me here today to speak to you about questions of inhumane perjury and truth and justice in law. Because these things I feel very deeply in my heart, and I hope until I draw my dying breath, I will continue to feel deeply about them. And I want to share with you some of the implications of that I have thought about. Now, you can tell, first of all, from my title, Inhumane Perjury, the foundational role of truth and justice in law, that the issue I'm here to talk to you about today is not the issue of abortion. I am here, in fact, to talk about something much wider and deeper and contextual, and in my opinion, even more important than the issue of abortion, as important as that issue is. The issue that I'm raising is whether inhumanity and perjury can legitimately coexist with truth and justice in law. In other words, what collective decisions will we make in our laws about the treatment of others? And I argue that inhumanity and perjury cannot legitimately coexist with truth and justice in law, but in fact they erode the very foundation of the rule of law with terrible spillover social consequences. Now that said, there are many people who are both for the practice of abortion and who are against the practice of abortion, who believe that abortion can only be justified by resort to inhumane perjury and evasion of the rule of law. And for people who elevate abortion above every other issue, when I raise my concerns about opposing inhumanity and perjury and about supporting truth and justice as the foundation of law, people who elevate abortion think that I'm talking about abortion. And that's all I'm talking about, because that's all that concerns them. But that is exactly the opposite of what reason dictates. Reason dictates that first we establish the primacy of truth and justice, and we rid ourselves of inhumanity and perjury, and then we can resolve all other issues, including abortion, including capital punishment, including whether or not to smoke in our personal vehicles. All other issues depend upon ridding ourselves of perjury and inhumanity and adopting truth and justice. Now, I believe in the power of ideas, by which I mean that I think that when you have a grasp of the concepts in your mind, an understanding of what elements combine to reach or to compose a certain phenomenon, and an understanding of how those phenomena interrelate, I believe that you can speak with greater power than if you lack that understanding. So I want to speak to you today about some of the concepts that are relevant to the question that I've raised, the question of inhumane perjury and truth and justice. And I want to give you some, at least, light touch of the significance and interrelatedness of these ideas. Each one of them could probably be the subject of an hour or a day's exposition, but I do want to introduce you to them. And I've created a concept map to help us a little bit with this. And I want to begin by focusing on that central idea of justice and the rule of law. What do we mean by justice? People have debated that for ages. You know, I started with a little timer here, and I forgot to turn it on. So you're going to have to hope that I can time myself internally without the benefit of that. Here's what we mean by justice: giving each person what he or she deserves, or in more traditional terms, giving each person his or her due. Justice and fairness are closely related terms and are today often used interchangeably. I go back to a 6th century codification of Roman law called the Institutes of Justinian, in which justice was defined as the constant and perpetual will to render to each his due. There are 4 important elements that come out of that definition, required constituents of justice. The first of them is that justice has to do with how individual people are treated. That's what we mean when we say to each his due. The second is that justice is a matter of claims which can be rightfully made against the agent who is dispensing justice. Whether I come to you and say, look, give me back the money I loaned you, or whether I go to the government and say, look, someone has killed my brother and I want justice, or whether I go to a tribunal or to an organization and say, do what's right, we're talking about claims which can be rightfully made against whoever it is from whom we are speaking justice. Third, justice can only be achieved with non-arbitrariness. Justice is the opposite of arbitrary. It means applying universal principles without exception. If we start doing things inconsistently, that's not justice. And fourth, justice requires an agent whose will alters the circumstances of the parties. If none of us are free to do anything, then what we do isn't just or unjust, it's just what we must do. Justice has to do with free decision-making, with autonomous decision-making. Now, there is a mirror image to this that I don't have much time to talk about today, but that I want to at least introduce you to, because not everyone embraces the idea of justice as I have just defined it for you. And the mirror image of justice is power and domination. And everything that I tell you about justice is reflected in reverse in a world where power and domination are the defining feature and the motivating power. And in fact, this is the world we live in Canada today at least, unfortunately. And it is often, I think, flowing from the writing of a 20th century philosopher by the name of Michel Foucault, whose ideas, in my opinion, were entirely pernicious. And he had the idea that there is no such thing as justice. In fact, all there is power and domination. And anybody who talks about justice is just fooling you because they're just looking for another way to dominate you with power. And if you have the chance to study this issue, I hope you will reach the same conclusion as I have, that in fact Michel Foucault was entirely wrong, and that there is such a thing as justice, and that it's not all just about power. If I have time, I might come back to this, but for the moment I want to return to this concept map instead. Because you'll see at the very top of it two categories entitled individual human flourishing and collective human flourishing. They're at the top because, in my view, these are the only sane and right-thinking goals that any human being can aim at. If we are not seeking the flourishing of individual human beings, achieved through the flourishing of collective societies, then we are somehow a little off kilter. It's important to know what we mean by flourishing. Flourishing means to grow or to develop in a healthy or vigorous way, to be successful or prosperous. In other words, to coin another pop culture phrase, to be all that you can be. And isn't that, after all, what each of us wants for himself or herself, and what each of us should want for each of our brothers and sisters who are floating in this sea of time and space along with us? Now, how do we achieve flourishing? Well, you'll see that those concepts rest upon the idea of peace. And peace is another concept that has been debated for ages. What do we really mean by peace? Some people think that peace is simply the absence of violence. And of course, that's not true at all. You know, Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein achieved peace in their countries. I should say they achieved the absence of violence in their countries, but they did not achieve peace, because peace is something much more than the absence of violence. It is the reconciliation of competing demands and competing rights and competing desires and wants and needs. And so it's that reconciliation that I speak about when I refer to peace. And it is only in a society or a world of peace where people can truly flourish and societies can truly flourish. You'll notice a little pink line coming off from the right. That's because this diagram is connected to this diagram. People who pursue power and domination will always tell you that their goal is peace. But in fact, it isn't. It is the elimination of opposition, the elimination of competing needs and desires and wants, not their reconciliation. And unfortunately, that means conflict, whether it's suppressed or overt. Conflict remains in a system of domination and power. And that can only ultimately lead to human degradation and stagnation and ultimately death, both collectively for societies and for individuals. Mahatma Gandhi once said, think of it, every dictator, every tyrant has ultimately come to an end. Only love endures. And in that, he was reflecting on the fact that power and domination always lead to death and stagnation and degradation. In any event, peace does not. Peace depends upon justice, because you cannot in an unjust society have peace. People will have a grievance instead. Their claims will not be adjudicated in a manner that they can accept. Conflict will continue unresolved, even if it's suppressed. Now I'd like to work down in this concept map, because you'll see I've numbered 4 supports for justice. Those are the 4 things that I mentioned to you a moment ago as components of justice as defined in Justinian's institutes. Agency and freedom, otherwise known as autonomy. I could spend all day talking about that. It is what gives our life coherence. If we do not have autonomy and our own agency to make decisions, then in fact we cannot flourish. And as I mentioned, we cannot make just decisions if we are not free to do so. Impartiality means no favoritism and no negative aspiration, no negative putting down either. It means that everyone is entitled to receive the same treatment without favor or penalty. The 2 in the middle, in my opinion, are the most important. And I'm going to speak to the question of non-arbitrariness. Because how can we achieve non-arbitrariness? What that really means, let's see if I can come back to that in my notes and give it to you word for word. It means that where 2 cases are relevantly alike, they should be treated in the same way. How can we know that 2 cases are relevantly alike? Well, we can only know it by evidence-based observation or truthfulness. In the absence of evidence-based observation or truthfulness, everything is just arbitrary. We can pick whatever we want and say it's different or it's the same. Non-arbitrariness requires that degree of truthfulness. It means also embracing advancing knowledge, not freezing in time our understanding, immune altogether from the light of advances and discovery. We have to be willing to change in our perception if in fact we gain new information. Even Justice Bertha Wilson, who you may know as the somewhat villainized judge of the Supreme Court of Canada, who wrote the majority decision in the Morgentaler case authorizing abortion in Canada, did not abandon this principle of non-arbitrariness. She, in fact, wrote that Parliament should inform itself from the relevant disciplines in determining whether the interests of a child before birth deserve protection. She herself instructed Parliament to look for the relevant evidence so as not to make an arbitrary decision. Parliament, of course, didn't do that, but at least Justice Wilson was faithful to that element of justice. This idea of non-arbitrariness is rejected by postmodernism. That's another issue that I think you would be well advised to look into because it represents our greatest enemy, in my opinion, in the idea world that we live in. And it is based upon, in my opinion, Michel Foucault's understanding of things. It's a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism, a general suspicion of reason, and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. So those folks don't think that there is such a thing as being non-arbitrary. They think everything is arbitrary because everything is just an exercise of power. The opposite of non-arbitrariness and the truthfulness that it requires is perjury. So here's a definition of perjury for you, and that is knowingly making a false statement in an official proceeding, generally because it's under oath or affirmation. So when Parliament makes a statement and promulgates it into law and sends it into courtrooms as a requirement that judges must accept, Parliament, if the statement is false, is committing perjury. Because, in fact, it is going into an official proceeding, and if it's a false statement in an official proceeding, it's perjury. The last conceptual element that I want to discuss is the question of human rights. Human rights. That's at the center, and it's another pillar for justice. And that flows from what I said to you earlier, that justice is about making rightful claims. So we need to be able to adjudicate which claims are rightful and which are not rightful. And what we're talking about are human rights, because these are claims between humans. Claims that arise from general moral principles. And such claims are not, such rights are not a gift of the state which can be taken away or canceled or even given. They exist independently of the state. In turn, human rights have to be universal. By that I mean they have to be available equitably to all members of a society, including or covering all or a whole, collectively or distributively, without any limit or exception. The moment you say, I have a right to say whatever I want, but you don't, then you are not talking about human rights, because human rights by nature and by definition must be universal. Also, human rights depend upon equality of worth, and in fact that means recognition of the humanity of every individual, the inherent worth and dignity of every individual. By that we mean the quality or state of being worthy, honored, or respected. In essence, human dignity consists of both the inherent worth of a person and their outward bearing. The moment you stop to think that you're better than somebody else, that you have more worth, and therefore what you want or need should be elevated over what they want or need, you are denying human rights. You are denying the element of humanity upon which human rights are based. And in fact, that's the opposite of being humane. It is being inhumane. When we say that someone is inhumane, we mean that they are lacking human warmth, pity, or kindness, and they're not fit for human needs. A lack of compassion or empathy and a cruel or barbarous nature. We instinctively know that people who don't recognize the worth in others are barbarians. People who think that somehow they're better than everyone else are going to act like barbarians. It's only by recognizing the essential equal worth and dignity of every human being that we ourselves become humane. And dehumanization occurs through the act of depriving someone or something of human qualities, personality, or dignity. It can also mean treating someone in a way that is degrading or makes them seem less than human. This can involve obscuring or demeaning a person's humanity or individuality through language or actions or law. So think of instances that you're aware of dehumanization and how savagely barbaric that is, to treat someone as less than human or not human, or in a manner that degrades their humanity. And yet, this happens in our language, in our actions, and in our laws. Which brings me to section 223, which crystallizes in Canadian law the inhumanity and the perjury about which I'm speaking. And section 223 says that a child becomes a human being within the meaning of this act when it has completely proceeded in a living state from the body of its mother, whether or not it has breathed, it has an independent circulation, or the navel string is severed. And I kind of emphasize the word it when I read it because there is no more dehumanizing pronoun that you can call someone. So if I point to you and say, hey, it, what do you think of that? We know that I'm dehumanizing you. And that's what this paragraph does right from the get-go. And the other interesting thing about it, it's rather odd to see in black and white the fact that in Canada, some children are not human beings. They're still children under the law, but they're not human beings because we have children who become human beings, and then we have children who don't become human beings under this law. And of course, what's readily observable in this particular definition is that it is completely arbitrary. We all know that the line of birth is an arbitrary marker for whether or not an individual is a human being. In fact, this definition says even if you're breathing, you're not necessarily a human being, provided that your little toe remains in the birth canal of your mother. How arbitrary is that to separate breathing human beings on the basis of where their body parts are and determine that some are human and some are not? And so, of course, being arbitrary, what I'm really saying is that this is a false definition. It is not supported by evidence-based observation. And that evidence-based observation is indeed available to us in the 21st century. Now, sometimes when I first started talking to people about this, they said, oh, you got to be kidding. You're making that up. It can't be that that's really part of Canadian law. A lot of people don't believe that children aren't considered human beings until they fully proceeded in a living state from their mother's body. So I went to the trouble of making a copy of the book in which this law was first written down, and if you know your Latin, you'll see under the title page, well, I've written it in for you. This was first written down in 1644. Almost 400 years ago, this law was in effect. And I've also copied the page in which this section is found. It's in chapter 7. It's in Latin, so I've translated it here. If a woman be quick with child and by a potion or otherwise kills it in her womb, or if a man beat her whereby the child dies in her body and she's delivered of a dead child, this is a great misprision and no murder. Now, by saying it's a great misprision, and what they're talking about there is abortion, and they were saying it's an offense. A misprision is an offense. It's just not murder. And of course, you can see that that's the first part of this definition, but that's the part that was removed from Canadian law in 1968. The second part was not removed, however. If the child be born alive and dieth of the potion, battery, or other causes, this is murder. For in law it is accounted a reasonable creature in rerum natura when it is born alive. So that born alive rule was preserved in Canadian law, and when Canada became a nation in 1867, some years after that, it codified its laws in our criminal code, and both of these sections, both of these parts were codified in the Canadian Criminal Code. And then in 1968, along came the government and deleted the first part of it, but left the second, which is that 400-year-old definition of human being, which we know to be arbitrary and false. You can look at this as an example of medieval medicine, because in truth, the judges at that time were just trying to set down an evidentiary rule to say how you can know when you're dealing with a human being or not. And in those days, you didn't even know a child existed until quickening, when the child started to move in the mother's womb. And indeed, until the child was born, you didn't know what was going to come out. Often children were subject to mutation and deformation and not able to survive even for more than a few minutes. Often they were born dead. So the judges just thought they were talking common sense here to say, look, we don't know. There's no evidence that a child is a human being until the moment of birth. So let's just proceed on that basis. And then Edward Cook codified that. And then, in spite of changing evidence for 400 years, the Canadian Parliament affirmed it. You can also look at this with the historical perspective that it's an outgrowth of Anglo-Saxon law. You know, I've gone back to Justinian in the 6th century for Roman law, but all that concept of justice was lost in the Dark Ages. When the Anglo-Saxons came into England and took over. And the Anglo-Saxon concept of law wasn't based on the Justinian concept of justice that I've explained to you. It was based on the idea of public order. Let's maintain the peace. So if you killed my brother, I might have the urge to go after you in a feud or a vendetta and kill you, but instead the king will come along and take control of the situation and force you to pay 30 pieces of gold to me as compensation so as to allay my hurt feelings and loss, and therefore I wouldn't disturb the public peace by going after you with a perpetual feud or a vendetta. That was the whole idea of the law, and that was actually called blood gold or blutgeld. And every other law was intended in the same way for the king to keep public order. It had nothing to do with justice in the sense that I've described it to you, nothing to do with recognizing the humanity of others. And so, of course, this definition was all about maintaining the public peace, also not really about defining humanity in the way that we can now do so. And other practices followed the same line. The idea of slavery is that an African became a human being when they were able to purchase their freedom. Until that time, they were simply a commodity to be bought and sold. not able to buy and sell themselves. No humanity, no justice in that, but public order, because established interests depended on slavery, and economic and commercial relations depended upon slavery. So nobody wanted to rock the boat. Even Abraham Lincoln didn't want to abolish slavery before the American Civil War began, because it would have rocked the boat and caused conflict in the United States. The Nazis, with their eugenics laws, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but they came up with the same idea, that public order will be improved if we eliminate mentally defective people. Therefore, we will not consider them to be human beings until we can establish that they are not mentally defective, and that way our social order will be improved. Nothing to do with truthfulness, nothing to do with humanity, only to do with inhumanity and perjury. The Canadian Persons Law, famous in our country at least, said that women would not be considered fully as human beings entitled to political and civil liberties, at least not until the Privy Council over in England declared that they were in fact full human beings and entitled to the same political and civil rights as men. Again, this law had nothing to do with truthfulness or humanity. It was all about inhumanity and perjury in order to preserve the existing civil order. This began to change over centuries. And I would argue, even going back to the time when Canada was formed and the English recognized the rights of the French speakers already established in Canada to believe what they wanted in their religion and to speak their own language, they were beginning to treat people with humanity as subjects, not objects in the social order, subjects in their own right with autonomy. So over centuries, the Justinian definition began to reassert itself, until finally, in the middle of the 20th century, amid the great suffering and inhumanity and false claims that were being made, not just by the Nazis, but by others, genocides of the Armenians, and all sorts of terrible death and destruction, the great leaders of the world came together and they enacted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the first 39 words of that declaration are whereas, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of every member of the human family are the foundation for freedom, justice, and peace in the world. That's a legal principle, and it reflects the Justinian idea of justice that I've mentioned to you, because it is based on the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable human rights universally, all members of the human family. There is no wider catchphrase that one can use than all members of the human family. And it is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So they were bridging a little bit here because they're still talking about peace, the idea of public order. But they mean something much more than peace. They mean the resolution of conflicting wants, needs, and claims that I've spoken to you about previously, that cannot be achieved without freedom and justice. This, in my opinion, was a watershed, the high water mark of justice returning to our society. Unfortunately, however, it isn't accepted by everyone. And in fact, since the time that it was enacted, there has been a steady rollback of the principle of human rights. As I said, in the 60s when I was growing up, it was going strong. But after that, things have gone downhill. I should mention, by the way, this little statement, because often I'm confronted by people saying, oh, you're just being religious. human rights are not about religion. And Raymond Burke in 2009 made this very astute observation. While true religion does teach natural moral law, the observance of moral law is not a confessional or a religious practice. It is rather a response to what is inscribed in the depths of every human heart. The necessity to be non-arbitrary in justice and the necessity to recognize the humanity and equal humanity of others we meet is in fact inscribed in the heart of every man and woman. Nonetheless, power and domination persist as a theme for some people. And in 2012, when I raised this issue of inhumane perjury in Parliament, just by happenstance or maybe providence, across the globe, a couple of medical ethicists published this paper in the Journal of Medical Ethicists, which, I kid you not, was titled, "After Birth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live?" And this is the conclusion they came to. We claim that killing a newborn could be ethically permissible in all the circumstances where abortion would be. Now, interestingly, they based that conclusion on the arbitrariness of that born alive rule that I've mentioned to you. They pointed out quite rightly how arbitrary it was to say that a child is a human being 5 minutes after birth, but not a human being 5 minutes before birth. And then they accepted that arbitrariness and they said, well, it's arbitrary, so let's just move the line. And if we can justify taking the life of a child before complete birth, well, then we can also justify taking the life of a child after complete birth. And of course, where they and I disagree is that we, in my opinion, should not accept arbitrariness, inhumanity, and perjury. We should, in fact, seek true justice if we want a society that flourishes and leads to the flourishing of individuals. There was a great hue and cry, I'm happy to say, around the world against this paper. And the authors tried to walk it back a little bit after that. Because people know, as Raymond Burke said, they know in their heart that inhumanity is wrong and that perjury is wrong. They know, in fact, I'm going to present you with this too. Now, this has a little bit of controversy associated with it, but bear with me. When you talk to people about abortion, people don't want to talk about it. However, you look to point 3, when you actually present people with the evidence of human development before birth, by the time you get up to protecting people 6 months gestational age, 72% of Canadians want to do that. They want to protect children who have attained at least 6 months of gestational age. Now, I'm not saying that they're right in picking that marker, but I'm giving this to you as evidence that ordinary people want in their hearts to be humane. They want in their hearts to make just decisions based on truthful observation and evidence. And we have to encourage that. We have to fight for that. And so, by the way, I'm going to offer you this as well. Justice Wilson, I've already referred to this, she too, in her heart, knows that we should be humane and that we should not be arbitrary but seek evidence. I've given you this slide. I don't know if you'll get copies of slides or not, but it's just a summary of how various states in the United States are adjusting this born alive rule in order to reflect up-to-date evidence. And it mentions ultrasonography, fetal heart monitoring, fetoscopy. It mentions the idea of studies in neonatal perception and physiology. And I could add to that genetics and neurology. there is evidence that is available to us today that wasn't available 400 years ago when judges were grappling with how to establish that someone was a human being at birth. And that evidence ought to be examined by us today if we wish to pursue justice and achieve the peace which brings collective societal flourishing and leads to individual flourishing. So in 2012, I maybe too innocently thought that this was an issue that should be brought to the attention of the Parliament of Canada. And I began with what we affectionately in Parliament call an SO 31, a 60-second statement, just to raise the issue and to say, look, we can reconcile questions about human rights, and doing so is in fact a noble undertaking. And of course I was ignored. So I introduced a motion to raise the same issue, and all I didn't suggest the answer to any of these questions. All I did was to ask Parliament to form a committee to study the issue. And in fact, I specifically directed that that committee should not come back with any single answer, but as you'll see when you read this in detail, should report on the whole range of options available to Parliament on the question of this inhumane perjury in section 223. I also didn't mention the word abortion because it's not about abortion. It's about humanity and truthfulness and justice, which have much wider implications than just on the abortion question. I specifically told the committee that they should only make recommendations which were consistent with the rulings of the Supreme Court of Canada, because I knew that the Supreme Court of Canada still, at least at that time, was paying lip service to the idea of justice and evidence-based truthfulness. And I wasn't afraid of any of those rulings for that reason. Well, I've asked for you to be given a copy of the 5-minute closing argument I made in this case. You won't have time to read it now, but you've got it, so I'd like you, when you get home, to read it through in detail, because it will remind you of everything I'm telling you here today. In those remarks, I tried to emphasize how this was an issue of justice, which relied upon human rights, which relies upon humanity and non-arbitrariness and truthfulness. And I would like you to share those remarks as broadly as you can with others in the community so as to pursue this issue effectively. I had in mind to spend a few minutes telling you some interesting behind-the-scenes stories about what went on when I was pursuing that motion, but in the interest of brevity, I'm going to skip over that for now, and if anyone has an interest, they can ask me about that later. I don't know for sure where my time is, so I'm going to go on to phase 2.
15 minutes.
Yeah. What I would like to do is to put this issue in stark relief for you and talk to you about where we go from here. So, when Parliament defeated this motion, in effect, they affirmed the inhumane perjury of section 223. They reverted to the barbarity of the Dark Ages past. The majority of MPs decided that protecting their personal or political interests was more important than recognizing the humanity of others. They decided that human rights should not be universal. They carved out an exception, refusing to recognize the humanity of those whose existence was inconvenient to their power, an exception which denied truthful facts and observation. In effect, they adopted, whoops, going the wrong way, they adopted this stagnating and degrading and death-filled philosophy of domination and power, which denies humanity, which promotes inequality, which relies upon falsehood to reach arbitrary decisions. They did that in your name, bringing shame on each and every one of us. Shame. They embraced a corrupt lie with the support of all too many Canadians. Think about the result of adopting this modality in Canada. The foundation of freedom, of justice, and of peace referred to in the Declaration of Human Rights was yanked out from under the legal and governing institutions of Canada. The barbaric inhumanity and false claims of ages past now has ample room to grow in Canada, in what was previously an enlightened liberal democracy. We're no longer guaranteed equality because Parliament can decide otherwise. Instead, we're all liable to have our humanity savagely denied or diminished whenever it suits the interests of those in power. I hope you understand from what I'm saying how much bigger an issue that is for each and every one of us, even than the issue of abortion, which is simply one example of it. By legitimizing the supreme injustice of falsely denying the very humanity of individuals inconvenient to their power, Parliament removed any restraint over all lesser oppressions. And we're already seeing the fruits of that. Whether it's punishing people for their freely expressed views, or refusing to allow citizens to follow the reasonable dictates of their own conscience, or whether it's suspending civil liberties in order to squash protests against power, or if it's inducements to commit suicide to vulnerable and destitute people, or whether it's officially sanctioned and imposed racial discrimination, all of those things are happening in Canada today. The list goes on. And it is all the result of adopting this modality instead of justice and the rule of law based on recognition of humanity and evidence-based truthfulness. Honesty demands the pessimistic assumption that even the enlightened world that we enjoyed at the time of my youth, is unlikely to return for our children or grandchildren. Without this model governing those in power, things are going to get worse and lead to the consequences of domination and obsession with power. And I don't know about you, but I found that to be a very, very bitter pill to swallow. And I've had to make a big attitude adjustment as a consequence. So what do we do? Well, for Christians and other believers, we find hope in God's providence, in our faith. As Julian of Norwich was quoted to have said, we believe that all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. God has things in hand. But you know what? Even atheists have resort to optimism in the face of tragedy. Where there's life, there's hope. Anyone can accept that truism. Or as is attributed to Oscar Wilde, among other people, everything is going to be fine in the end. If it's not fine, it's not the end. We keep working at things in whatever manner we can. Those are encouraging thoughts, but they need to be balanced with recognition of the intractable harshness and incompleteness that we encounter in the human condition. A fellow named Donald Bolin wrote described that. He said, when life seems to ask more than we can give, when human brokenness leads to a hunger for and an abuse of power, which in turn hurts and terrorizes others, when in 1,000 different ways we as individuals and as communities find it difficult and even impossible to live well and meaningful together, hope can seem to reside at a very distant and receding horizon. Anyone here ever heard of the Dred Scott decision? A few. In 1859 or thereabouts, 9 highly educated, enlightened, thoughtful, religious men sitting on the US Supreme Court decided that blacks would not be considered human beings under the law. They would instead be classified as commodities who could be bought and sold and could not themselves buy and sell. I often wonder, how did the lawyers who were speaking on behalf of black people to the Supreme Court take it when they realized that they couldn't convince the Supreme Court that black people were real human beings? What a discouraging and terrible burden it must have been for those lawyers. As a lawyer, I relate. And as someone who was unable to convince Parliament that inhumanity and perjury are wrong, I feel somewhat the same discouragement as they must have felt. Or we can think also of Lord Wilberforce, who spent literally decades running up against the established idea of slavery. And much of the time that he opposed it, he was in ill health. And how discouraging it must have been for him year after year, decade after decade, to be unable to convince people that inhumanity is wrong and that lying about whether someone is or is not a human being is wrong. How discouraged he must have felt. How do we overcome that discouragement? Well, I want to offer you 2 very deep well springs of hope. The first is in recognizing life itself. Someone once wrote that something is in the world holding all the frayed and tattered ends together in a fabric whose beauty will one day be visible to us. Life is beautiful, sacred, and trustworthy. Trustworthy. This echoes the inspiring words of a man named Rabbi Abraham Herschel, who said, "Just to be is a blessing. Just to live is holy." What they are saying, in another way, is that even with its seemingly intractable tragedies, you and I are part of this world. We were made for that. We were made for the world with all its tragedies, and we are indelibly suited to the world with all its tragedies and its beauty. And the world is suited to us. By our very nature, we are capable of bearing with whatever life brings us, including the discouragement and the intractability of injustice that we face in our world today. The second wellspring of hope that I wish to suggest to you is perspective. And this has both an external and an internal dimension. I spoke with a friend of mine a few months ago about this problem of discouragement and finding hope, and he told me a little bit about his story. When he was young, he grew up on a farm. And he said to me, "Stephen, you know, there were years when the crops failed. We had not enough food to put on the table. We went hungry. The creditors were banging at our door. We thought we might lose the farm. We didn't know where to go, what would happen to us. And what did my father do? Well, he went out and he planted next year's crops." And I found that kind of inspiring, because that's really the answer, is to remember that we can go out and plant next year's crops. We have to take that long-term, multi-year perspective. In other words, as someone once wrote, we can hold the human venture within a broader external narrative that can at least make some sense of the way things are. Sharing the big picture of what gives us hope opens the door to finding hope in the litany of even the smallest and most everyday things. For example, the first glimpse of the sun bending over the horizon with each new day gives us hope. That's the power of perspective, and I hope that this feeds your need for perspective. Why is recognition of humanity important? Because our goal is human flourishing, and that's the pathway we must take. Secondly, from an interior perspective, I believe that each of us must transform our hearts with a love for others as a deep and abiding motivation. If you had a little child who was drowning 20 feet offshore, you wouldn't stop to think about how high the waves were, or how poor a swimmer you were, or how tired you were because you worked too late the night before. You would jump in that water, motivated by your love for your child, and do whatever you could to rescue your child. And I believe that helping those around us without needing the satisfaction of a happy ending or even knowing the outcome is motivated by the same transformative love if we carry it within ourselves. And as counterintuitive as it might sound, we have to embrace the recognition that success or defeat are not the point. We don't need a happy ending. We don't need to know the outcome. Far-seeing perspective and our love for others motivate our efforts toward justice, toward humanity, toward evidence-based truthfulness. None of that depends upon our personally seeing that better world. And ironically, adopting that stance gives power to our own resolve, and it commends to others our perspective and our love. Even atheists recognize that power when they look at the efforts of the early Christians who faced the same sort of inhumanity and injustice and untruthfulness that we face in our society today. Now, I want to try and wrap up very quickly with translating all of this to concrete action. How do we take that motivation of perspective and of loving concern for our neighbors and turn it into actual conduct that will lead us to justice, humanity, and truthful evidence? And the very first step I recommend to everyone is to consciously take an inventory of your personal resources. Write it down on a list. Make a piece of paper and a pen, come together and take an inventory of what resources do you have. Obviously, you have financial resources, your wealth. You have some degree of time. You have technology, beautiful technologies like GPSs and Excel spreadsheets to expand your capabilities. In fact, your mind, the ideas and understanding and attitudes and choices that you make are your primary resource. The words you use, your friends and relationships, your vote and other political opportunities to participate, write them all down. These things together are your power to activate the search for justice, humanity, and truthfulness. Now, clearly, just voting every few years is not going to be enough to positively affect Canada's future. Many means need to be explored. We want to try to influence political decision-making beyond the 4-year cycle of elections. So the alert citizen uses several principles and takes a variety of practical actions. We cannot all dedicate the same amount of time and resources to political issues, so you don't have to pursue every suggestion that I'm about to make. Instead, take what suits your resources and talents. But I would highly recommend that you look this book up, A Citizen's Guide to Canadian Politics, because it was exactly intended to help people find out what they can do about the threats that we face in Canada today. There is the website for it, and I'm happy to say that I wrote chapter 10, How to Make Your Voice Count. So that's the one chapter I want you to be sure to read. I don't get any royalties, so I'm saying that's totally from altruistic motives. Whoops. Actually, I provided you with a handout of an outline of the items that you'll find in chapter 10. And it's composed of essentially 2 sections, first principles and then actual action strategies. Under first principles, I've covered things like making sure that you are well informed. Secondly, getting to know the people that you want to influence, and that determines identifying who you want to influence and where they are. Thirdly, becoming known to those people, building relationships and entering into dialogue with them. Demonstrating the depth of your passion. People know when you're being superficial, at least politicians know it. And if you go into them and you don't really care about what you're talking about, they won't care about it either. You have to demonstrate to those decision makers the depth of your passion, your concern, and your commitment by devoting your resources to it. And that means making sure you have your priorities right, because you can't be all things to all people. 5, you should enlist allies. Develop collective strength. That's really what this organization is about, I believe, is alliances. You should also locate what other people are doing. Don't duplicate things. Don't reinvent the wheel. 6, plan your work and work your plan. The most important thing you could do when planning any undertaking is to visualize what you want to occur and then put into place the elements that you see happening in that visualization. And most importantly, lastly, persist. Never ever stop, because that perspective and that love within you won't go away. As long as you love others, you must persist. That does mean, however, keeping your expectations realistic and understanding what it is you can accomplish. I've also provided you in that handout with a list of action strategies, how to make your voice heard by representatives and candidates. Well, you're already doing a lot of that. Petitions, making telephone calls, arranging office visits, but have you ever thought about inviting them to gatherings like this or other social occasions where they can get to know you? You know, your granddaughter's christening or your mother's retirement party. Get to know these people socially. You can also consider joining a party and collectively amplifying your voice with them. Secondly, let your voice be heard by your allies. Build a consensus. Again, that's probably second nature to everyone in this room. Thirdly, the third audience, after representatives and allies, is the broader community. This is a little tricky because you could talk all day about how to get people's attention in the broader community. Use novelty when you can. Use variety. Don't say the same thing all the time. Having said that, do say the same thing at least 7 times. Stephen Harper taught me that's the only way sometimes that you can break through people's consciousness is to repeat the same message at least 7 times. And always maintain your own legitimacy. Don't make yourself look foolish or illegitimate. With that, I've provided in this slide 10 of the easiest things that anyone can do. Regularly meet with your MP, not just when you have a concern, but say once a year in order to develop a relationship. Petitions, community action groups, joining parties, volunteering at election time. There's no better way for you to get to know an elected representative or for them to get to know you. Going to party conventions and writing letters to the editor and using social media. Now, maybe none of these suggestions will surprise you. In fact, hopefully you realize that the path to making your voice heard is really quite obvious once you set your mind to it. There's only one key, however, that you must discover for yourself, and that is your resolve. Find your passion. Transform yourself so that love for others is your passion. And that's how you will mobilize your power and take up strategies to make a difference, to help us to achieve a world in which justice and peace and truthfulness, non-arbitrariness, and the recognition of humanity are the principles which govern us.